The frost was so severe that breath froze before it had time to disperse, and heavy icicles formed on beards and eyelashes. In the dark courtyard, surrounded by a wooden fence, a man sat motionless on his knees, naked to the waist, wearing a torn fur cloak. His lips trembled, but continued to move, pronouncing the words of a psalm. His voice would break into a wheeze, then gather strength again, even though only steam escaped from his mouth, and the skin on his shoulders had already turned a bluish, almost black color. His numb fingers still clutched a cross frozen into his palm, making it look as if the metal had dug into his flesh. The servants and guards, standing at a distance, did not dare to approach, not out of pity, but because the frost was penetrating their bones, and the cold emanating from the Archbishop himself seemed unnatural. This man, once the formidable ruler of the northern dioceses, had been accused of treason against the crown and of conspiring with the enemies of the faith. His name was known in every monastery, from the coast to the mountains, and his orders were obeyed by princes and boyars. But by the winter in question, his power had collapsed as quickly as a fortress wall under the pressure of ice. A denunciation signed by his associates accused him of having relations with reformers and of transferring church lands to foreign advisors. He was brought to the capital under heavy guard, in a closed sleigh, where he spent almost a week. Servants testified that he began coughing up blood on the way, and that his eyes often wandered, as if he were talking to invisible companions. In the fortress where he was placed, the walls were frozen from the inside, the windows were boarded up, and the cell smelled of dampness and old straw. From the very first days, the prison doctor performed bloodletting, explaining that it was necessary to expel bad juices. The Archbishop was wiped with rags soaked in vinegar and rubbed with ointments made of fir resin and animal fat. But the cold and inflammation of his lungs progressed. Yellow spots appeared on his face. His breathing became wheezy, his lips cracked, and when he spoke, he often clutched his chest as if something were tearing him apart from within. In the first weeks, interrogations were daily. He was seated on a high chair in a damp hall where the wind blew through cracks in the walls. Parchments with accusations were laid out before him, demanding confessions. He answered tersely, with difficulty, and increasingly resorted to quotations from the Psalms. One of the scribes made a note. His speech has become confused. He often confuses day and night, and sometimes claims that the Lord appeared to him in the form of a burning tree. When the Archbishop's health deteriorated sharply, the prison guards were ordered not to allow anyone except a doctor and a confessor to see him. Servants claimed that at night a strange scraping sound came from the cell, as if he was scratching the walls with his fingernails. The doctor noted in his report that the nails on his hands were broken and blackened, and his palms were covered in abrasions and cracks. By the beginning of the third week, he began to have convulsions. The doctor tried to give him hot wine with crushed poppy seeds, but after a few sips, he choked and vomited. His feet were swollen from the cold. The skin on his feet was cracked and bleeding. The wounds were festering, and the smell from under the blankets became unbearable. The confessor who was allowed to see him before his execution wrote in his letter, he asked not for forgiveness, but that God would take him quickly, for every minute in this body was torture. The sentence was carried out in the cold. He was taken out on one of the coldest days of winter, without a fur coat, wearing only a thin robe, and sat on his knees in the center of the courtyard. He was surrounded by soldiers, and the clerk read aloud the charges. The Archbishop did not argue, but began to sing psalms. His lips sang, and his teeth chattered until his body stopped responding. After several hours, his breathing stopped. The guards hesitated to touch him for a long time, until one of the soldiers noticed that his fingers were clenched around a cross, and they had to cut off his hand to free the sacred object. The body was thawed in the barracks, but when it was moved, the skin on his shoulders and back had stuck to the fabric of his robe in places and came off with it. The doctor wrote, "From the cold, his flesh was firm, but after warming, the smell was so bad that the guards turned away. After the execution, they were in no hurry to bury the Archbishop's body. Formally, this was explained by the need for a church trial over his memory, but in reality, a dispute over who would get his land and income began on the same day. The inner courtyards of the fortress were filled with messengers. Every hour, new horsemen arrived, from boyars, princes, monastery abbots, and even from distant merchant guilds, whose caravans the Archbishop had once taxed. In letters and reports preserved in the archives, one can find records of how people secretly divided among themselves not only the deceased's property, but also positions that had previously depended on his will. The senior nobility insisted that his successor should be one of their own, a man loyal to the throne and the old laws. The younger ones, who had recently risen to become advisors to the sovereign, sought to install their own candidate, loyal only to them, on the throne. In this dispute, the voices of the supporters of the new church line were the loudest, accusing the deceased of adherence to old superstitions and unwillingness to support the reform of worship. Meanwhile, the body remained in the fortress's ice-cold storeroom. The doctor tried to embalm it with primitive means. He washed the intestines with a mixture of wormwood and vinegar, and rubbed a mixture of wax and crushed myrtle into the skin. But in his reports, he wrote explicitly that due to frostbite and cracks in the skin, the liquid quickly leaked out and a putrid smell appeared in the incisions. Access to the body was strictly restricted. Even the Archbishop's closest relatives were not allowed to see him without permission. Rumors circulated that one of the soldiers guarding the storeroom had seen the sovereign's clerk come there at night and spend a long time rummaging through papers hidden in the sleeves of the deceased's robe. In the capital, the news of the execution provoked mixed reactions. In churches, Thanksgiving services were held for the deliverance from the traitor, but in some monasteries, nuns secretly commemorated him as a martyr. Merchants and craftsmen said that now the duties would be reduced, but they feared that the new rulers would take even more. The political landscape changed rapidly. Having lost their protector in the Supreme Council, several northern monasteries came under the direct control of the court. Those who openly mourned the Archbishop risked being accused of sympathizing with the enemies of the throne. A report by one of the foreign ambassadors has been preserved, in which he wrote, "The death of this man has changed the entire northern region. There is no agreement among the boyars, the clergy is divided, and the sovereign himself has become even more suspicious than before. Every new day brings new denunciations." The Archbishop's power died with him, but the shadow of his name hung over the court for a long time. Some called him a traitor, others a martyr, and both sides were ready to shed blood to prove their point. The Archbishop's downfall began long before the winter in which he died. In the spring, 9 months before his execution, people whose loyalty was questionable began to appear in his entourage. According to his secretary, he himself became secretive and suspicious, ceasing to trust even those who had served him for decades. The first denunciations were prompted by his meetings with envoys from the northern lands, whose cities had recently been at the center of disputes between the crown and the church. The sovereign believed that the Archbishop was conducting secret negotiations to transfer these lands in exchange for military assistance against internal enemies. Chronicle writers recorded, he began to refuse to appear at council, citing illness or prayer, but at the same time, he received people who were not recognized by the court. Rumors of his sympathies for the reformers spread quickly. It was said that, in the refectory, he ordered psalms to be read in simple language, without pompous ceremonies, and that he secretly allowed monks to copy books banned by the capital's censors. The chronicler of one of the monasteries wrote, he said that the truth of God is not in gold or rituals, but in the word, and this brought upon him the wrath of the powerful. By autumn, a whole network of enemies was already working against him. The sovereign's advisors pushed the ruler to believe that the archbishop was capable of leading a rebellion, and some boyars openly declared that his power was too great. Secret reports mentioned that there were discussions in the palace about eliminating him without trial. But the sovereign insisted on a public execution to demonstrate the power of the law. During this period, the archbishop's health began to deteriorate rapidly. According to his doctor, he suffered from constant chest pains, nighttime coughing fits with blood, and his fingers began to lose sensitivity. He was bled every 2 days. His body was rubbed with St. John's wort infusion, and bear fat was rubbed into his joints. But this only weakened him. His closest assistants began to disappear one by one. One was found dead on the road to the monastery. Another was arrested for slandering the sovereign. Fearing for their lives, his servants began to report his slightest words. One report mentioned, "The master said that he does not recognize the authority of people who hold the sword above the cross." This was recorded as sedition. The arrest took place quietly, without fanfare. At the beginning of winter, guards entered his residence with the sovereign's order. He was given only enough time to get dressed and take his cross. From that moment on, the road to the fortress, a cold cell, and endless interrogations became his only reality. During his first days in prison, he still hoped for protection from influential friends, but soon realized that even those who owed him everything had turned their backs on him. In a letter intercepted by the guards, he wrote to his brother, "They all feast at my table, but when the wolves came, they left me alone." It is now clear that his execution was not so much a punishment for treason as the result of a long, carefully planned struggle for power, in which illness and winter only hastened the denouement. On the day of the execution, the frost was particularly severe. Before dawn, a town crier passed through the streets of the capital, reading out the sentence, and a crowd gathered at the fortress courtyard. People stood in the semi-darkness, sheltering under cloaks and scarves, but no one left, waiting for the spectacle. The archbishop was led out of his cell, supported by 2 men. He was wearing a thin cassock. His fur cloak had been taken from him the night before. His skin had turned a deathly grey. Dark circles had formed under his eyes. His lips were cracked, and frost had formed on his cheeks. He could barely stand, but his gaze remained steady. The soldiers sat him down on his knees in the middle of the courtyard, on the snow trampled by hundreds of boots. The clerk began to read the charges, but the Archbishop interrupted him with a loud singing of a psalm. His voice was hoarse, but confident, and according to eyewitnesses, the crowd fell silent. He sang until his lips stopped moving. Several hours passed before the guards were certain that he had stopped breathing. When they tried to take the cross away, they found that it had frozen to his palm. They were unable to pry his fingers open and had to cut off his hand. The body was taken to the barracks, where it began to thaw. The doctor noted that the fabric of the robe had frozen to the shoulders and back, and when it was removed, the skin came off with it. By evening, the smell of decomposition had set in. Attempts to embalm the body with vinegar and herbs were unsuccessful. The internal organs began to decompose rapidly. The news of the Archbishop's death caused an uproar. In the capital, fights broke out between his supporters and opponents. In monasteries, some held Thanksgiving services, while others held secret memorial services. In the north, unrest broke out. Peasants loyal to the Archbishop refused to pay new taxes, and several military garrisons declared their disobedience. The Supreme Council urgently appointed a new Archbishop from among the sovereign's entourage, but within a week, denunciations began against him as well. The monastery lands belonging to the executed Archbishop were divided among several noble families, which led to fierce fighting. Foreign ambassadors wrote in their reports that the execution in the cold had become a symbol of the cruelty of the regime and had increased distrust of the court. One of them noted, "The death of this man, frozen with a cross in his hand, will live longer than his deeds." Thus ended the life of the Archbishop, but his execution did not bring peace. It only exposed the rot in the hearts of those who fought for power and marked the beginning of a new period of turmoil in which old allies became enemies overnight.